Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of the darkest corners of medieval life. Imagine losing your freedom in a world without modern laws, without fair trials as we know them, and without comfortable prison cells. In tonight's episode, what it was like to be a medieval prisoner, we'll slowly explore what happened when someone was locked behind cold stone walls in the Middle Ages. Before we begin, I'm curious, right now, as you're listening to this, which city are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I always love seeing where in the world these stories are travelling. And if you enjoy calm, slow history that helps you relax and drift to sleep, don't forget to subscribe. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's step back into the medieval world. In the Middle Ages, prison was not always a long-term punishment. It was often something else, a waiting room, a holding place, a shadow between accusation and judgment. Imagine living in a small medieval village. You wake at dawn, you work the fields, you know your neighbours, and then one day someone accuses you. Read aloud. Instead, a local lord's men read aloud. Instead, a local lord's men might arrive. They would not always explain much. They might simply say, "You are to come with us." Now imagine the feeling. Not knowing how long, not knowing what will happen, not knowing if you will return home. That uncertainty was often worse than the stone walls themselves. Where were medieval prisoners kept? Not all prisons looked like dark underground dungeons. Some were simple rooms in castles, some were towers, some were converted storage spaces. In larger cities like London or Paris, there were dedicated prison buildings. One famous example was the Tower of London itself, which held prisoners of various ranks over centuries. But for ordinary people in rural areas, imprisonment often meant a cold stone chamber, a wooden door, minimal light straw on the floor, no bed as we imagine it, just space and time. The first night. The first night was the hardest. When the door shut, the sound echoed. Footsteps faded. Silence settled. Medieval prisons were not designed for comfort. They were designed for containment. There might be a small slit in the wall, just enough to let in a line of daylight. At night, that line disappeared completely. Darkness in the medieval world was deep. No electric lights, no glowing screens, no street lamps outside, only shadows. You would hear distant sounds, wind against stone, water dripping, perhaps another prisoner coughing in the dark, and your thoughts would grow louder. Who became prisoners? Not everyone in a medieval prison was a violent criminal. Many were debtors, political rivals, accused thieves, people awaiting trial. Sometimes, prison was simply a way to pressure someone's family to pay fines. If you owed money and could not pay, you might be locked up until someone paid for you. Justice was not standardized. It varied by region, by lord, by era. What was legal in one town might not be in another. This unpredictability made imprisonment frightening. Food and daily survival. Food was minimal, sometimes bread and water, sometimes thin soup. In some places, prisoners depended on family members bringing food. If no one brought anything, survival became uncertain. There were no scheduled meal trays delivered 3 times a day. Hunger was part of confinement. Water might be stale. Air might be damp. In underground cells, moisture clung to stone walls. Winter was cold beyond comfort. Summer was suffocating. The social side of prison. Not all prisoners were isolated alone. Some cells held multiple people. Strangers forced into close proximity. Different crimes, different backgrounds. Sometimes friendships formed. Sometimes tension grew. Without constant supervision, prisoners created their own small social order. Stories were shared, whispers exchanged, rumours about upcoming trials passed from mouth to mouth. In a strange way, prison became its own tiny world. Time moves differently. In medieval prison, there was no clock on the wall, no calendar handed to you. Time was measured by light, morning glow through the slit, afternoon brightness, evening dimness, then darkness. days blurred together. Without work, without routine, the mind wandered. Some prayed constantly. Some replayed events in their head. Some counted bricks in the wall. Some simply waited. Waiting was the true punishment. Punishment or protection? Interestingly, prison was not always the final punishment. In many cases it was temporary. You might be fined, released, publicly shamed, forced to perform labour. Long-term imprisonment as a sentence became more common later in history. In much of the medieval period, prison was transitional, but even a short stay could change a person deeply. The psychological weight. Imagine not knowing your future. Will you be freed? Will you be fined? Will you face harsher consequences? That uncertainty pressed heavily on the mind. As we explored in earlier parts of this series, medieval people understood mental suffering through religious and humoral ideas. But here, in prison, isolation amplified everything. Fear, regret, anger, hope, all contained within stone walls. As night settles on your first day in confinement, the corridor grows silent. The guard's footsteps fade. A draught of cold air moves across the floor. You pull your thin cloak tighter, and in the darkness, you realize something. Freedom, once invisible and ordinary, now feels priceless. The first night has passed. Morning does not arrive with birdsong inside a prison cell. It arrives quietly, as a thin blade of pale light sliding through a narrow slit in the wall. You wake not because you are rested, but because the cold has settled into your bones. In the medieval world, prison was rarely designed for comfort. It was not meant to reform you. It was not meant to educate you. It was simply meant to hold you. And so, the second day begins, the cell itself. Imagine the space around you more clearly now. Stone walls, uneven and damp, mortar cracking in places, a faint smell of earth and old straw. If you're imprisoned inside a castle tower, perhaps like those in the Tower of London, your chamber may be higher above ground. The air might be slightly fresher, light slightly stronger, but if you are in a lower dungeon level, the air feels heavy. Moisture gathers in corners. Water drips slowly from somewhere unseen. The floor is hard, maybe scattered with straw that has not been changed in weeks. There is no furniture beyond perhaps a wooden plank, no blanket beyond what you were wearing when brought here. And the door, thick wood reinforced with iron, reminds you that leaving is not your choice. Morning without purpose. Outside prison walls, medieval life was defined by work. Fields needed tending, animals required feeding, bread had to be baked. But here there is no plough, no marketplace, no familiar rhythm of chores. And so time feels different. You sit, you stand, you pace, counting steps from wall to wall, 6 steps across, 4 steps wide. You memorize the cracks in the stone. You trace patterns in mortar with your eyes. Routine becomes something you invent. Some prisoners prayed at fixed hours, copying the rhythm of monasteries. Dawn prayer, midday prayer, evening prayer. Even those not deeply religious often clung to some structure, because without structure, the mind drifts. Food arrives. At some point, you cannot tell exactly when, footsteps echo in the corridor. A guard. The small opening in the door slides aside. Perhaps a rough loaf of bread is passed through. Maybe a wooden bowl with thin broth. In larger cities such as Paris, certain prisons had slightly more organized systems of food delivery. But in many smaller regions, provisions depended on the wealth of the jailer, or the generosity of family. If your family lives nearby and is permitted to visit, they might bring cheese, dried meat, or warmer clothing. If not, survival depends entirely on what is given. Food is not seasoned, not plentiful, not predictable. Hunger becomes a quiet companion. You learn to eat slowly, to save crumbs, to stretch moments of taste as long as possible. Light and darkness. As the day continues, sunlight shifts. The narrow slit in the wall allows a pale beam to move gradually across the floor. You watch it. When it reaches the opposite wall, you know afternoon has passed. When it fades entirely, you know evening has come. There are no candles provided for comfort. Light costs money. Darkness in medieval prisons was complete. And in darkness, imagination grows louder. Every small sound feels amplified. A distant cough, a rat moving along stone, the clink of iron chains in another chamber. Your senses sharpen, because there is little else to focus on. The other prisoners. You're not alone in the building. Voices occasionally echo. Low murmurs, arguments, sometimes crying. In some prisons, multiple prisoners shared a cell. Imagine 3 or 4 strangers confined in a small space. One accused of theft, one unable to repay debt, one awaiting judgment for a political dispute. Different stories, same walls. Conversations begin cautiously. What were you accused of? How long have you been here? Rumours spread quickly in confined spaces. Someone says trials are delayed. Someone says the Lord is away. Someone claims release is coming soon. Hope flickers and fades repeatedly. Cleanliness and discomfort. Medieval prisons were rarely clean. There were no modern sanitation systems. A bucket in the corner might serve as a latrine. The smell lingers. If straw bedding is present, it becomes damp and dirty over time. Lice and fleas are not uncommon. In wealthier castles, high-ranking prisoners might receive better conditions, but for ordinary people discomfort was constant. Winter cold seeps through stone relentlessly. Summer heat turns the chamber into a heavy, airless box. And yet, people endured. The human body adapts in surprising ways. The guards were not always cruel. Some were indifferent. Some were strict. Some were simply men doing a job assigned by a lord. Their authority was clear. They controlled food access, movement, information. Sometimes a guard might speak briefly through the door. Other times days pass without a word. The imbalance of power is absolute. Your world shrinks to the size of your cell, and the mood of the man holding the key. Waiting for judgment. In many medieval legal systems, imprisonment was temporary, a pause before something else. A fine, public punishment, release, or in serious cases, harsher consequences. Trials were not standardized like modern courts. Local lords, town councils, or royal officials decided outcomes. Sometimes ordeals were used in earlier medieval periods, trials by fire or water, based on the belief that divine judgment would reveal innocence or guilt. By later centuries, such practices declined, but justice still varied widely. The uncertainty weighs heavily. Each time footsteps approach, your heart quickens. Is this the moment? Is your name about to be called? Or will the footsteps pass by again? Coping in confinement. To survive mentally, prisoners created small rituals, scratching marks into stone to count days, reciting familiar stories, repeating prayers learned in childhood. Some sang quietly, some carved initials into walls, leaving behind proof of existence. If you were literate, rare but possible, you might compose words in your mind, memorizing them carefully, because memory becomes your only safe possession. Night again. As darkness falls once more, you understand something new. The first night was shock. The second night is awareness. You now know this is not a brief interruption. This is an experience that will reshape you. Stone walls do not simply confine the body. They press inward on thought. You begin to notice how precious simple things once were. The sound of wind across open fields, the warmth of shared meals, the ability to walk without asking permission. Freedom, once invisible, now feels almost sacred. Somewhere beyond the prison, life continues. Markets open, church bells ring, children run through streets. But here, inside stone and shadow, time slows to a near standstill, and as you settle against the wall for another restless sleep, you realize that survival here will not depend only on food or warmth. It will depend on the mind's ability to endure stillness. Another morning arrives. The same narrow beam of light slips across the stone floor. The same chill lingers in the air, but today feels different. Footsteps approach earlier than usual. They stop at your door. Metal scrapes against metal. A key turns. For days, perhaps weeks, you have waited. And now, without warning, the waiting shifts into movement. You're to stand before judgment. Those words carry weight. In the medieval world, justice was not distant or abstract. It was immediate, personal, often public. And so your third chapter begins, not inside the silence of your cell, but in the uncertain space between accusation and decision. Leaving the cell. The door opens fully for the first time since your confinement began. Light floods in, brighter than you remember. You blink. Your legs feel stiff as you step into the corridor. Stone walls stretch in both directions. Other doors remain closed. You sense eyes watching through cracks and shadows. A guard gestures forward. There are no handcuffs as we know them today, but rope bindings or simple iron restraints may secure your wrists, depending on the accusation. You walk. Each step echoes, and with every echo your thoughts grow louder. Where judgment happens, trials in the Middle Ages did not always occur in grand halls. Sometimes they were held in castle courtyards, sometimes in town squares, sometimes inside a lord's chamber. In larger cities like York or Rouen, more formal civic spaces existed for legal matters, but in many villages justice was local and direct. If you are a peasant, your case may be heard by a local lord or his appointed steward. If you are accused of a serious crime in a royal territory, a royal official might preside. Justice depends heavily on your social rank, the power of your accuser, the mood of the authority overseeing the case. Fairness exists, but it is not guaranteed in equal measure for all. The crowd, unlike modern courtrooms, medieval trials were often public. Villagers gather, whispers move through the air. Some look at you with curiosity, some with suspicion, some with quiet sympathy. You recognize faces. The baker who once sold you bread, the farmer who worked beside you last harvest, the woman who lives 3 houses down. Their eyes follow you. And suddenly, the weight of shame feels heavier than the stone walls ever did. The accusation. The accusation is spoken aloud. Perhaps you are accused of stealing grain, perhaps of failing to repay debt, perhaps of breaking a market rule or challenging authority. In earlier medieval centuries, some regions relied on what were called ordeals, physical tests believed to reveal divine judgment, trial by fire, trial by water. If you healed cleanly after touching hot iron, it was seen as a sign of innocence. If you sank in water, it was interpreted one way. If you floated, another. By the later Middle Ages, many such practices declined, replaced by witness testimony and oaths. Still, the system remains rooted in belief as much as evidence. Oaths and reputation. In a world without forensic science, reputation matters deeply. People may be called to speak about your character. Is he known to be honest? Has she caused trouble before? Neighbours become witnesses. Sometimes you may swear an oath of innocence, calling upon God as your witness. To lie under oath is believed to endanger not only your earthly life, but your eternal soul. Faith shapes justice. Truth is intertwined with belief. The Lord's authority. The presiding authority, perhaps a lord seated on a raised platform, listens. He represents order. He represents power, and his decision will ripple outward. Medieval justice systems were not entirely chaotic. Many regions developed structured legal traditions over time. In England, for example, evolving common law began shaping procedures during the reigns of kings like Henry II. But even structured systems depended on human judgment, and humans are influenced by bias, politics, and personal alliances. The fear of the unknown. As accusations are discussed, your heart pounds. Will you be fined? Will you be publicly shamed? Will you be released? In most medieval societies, long-term imprisonment was less common than other punishments. Fines were frequent, especially for non-violent offences. Public punishments such as time in stocks or public humiliation were also common. Serious crimes could bring harsher consequences, but much depends on context. You search the faces around you for clues, a raised eyebrow, a whispered exchange, a subtle nod, anything that might hint at your fate. The moment of decision. Finally, silence falls. The authority speaks. The words feel distant, as if carried on wind. If you're fortunate, you may be ordered to pay a fine, perhaps with assistance from family. If you cannot pay immediately, imprisonment may continue until the debt is settled. If you're judged guilty of a lesser offence, you may face public humiliation, standing in the marketplace while others observe. If the accusation is dismissed, you may be released. But even release does not erase the experience. Public punishment. Imagine, for a moment, being placed in the stocks in the village square, your hands and head secured in wooden frames. People walk past, some mock, some pity. Children stare. The purpose is not only punishment, but deterrence. Justice is meant to be seen. Shame becomes part of the sentence, and when the time ends and you are freed, the memory lingers long after. Return or release. If your case requires continued imprisonment, you're led back through stone corridors. If you're released, you step into open air. Sunlight feels almost overwhelming. The sky appears larger than you remember. And yet, freedom now feels fragile. You know how quickly it can disappear. Psychological impact. Whether freed or confined again, something has changed inside you. You have felt powerlessness. You have stood before judgment. You have understood how reputation, status, and circumstance shape destiny. In medieval society, justice is not only about law, it is about order, about hierarchy, about maintaining balance in a world where stability is precious and often fragile. As evening falls after your trial, the village grows quiet again. If you remain imprisoned, the door closes once more. If you are freed, you walk home slowly, aware of eyes still watching. Either way, the experience marks you. Stone walls may confine the body. Judgment lingers in the mind. The door has closed again. Or perhaps it never opened at all. For some medieval prisoners, judgment did not bring quick release. Fines could not be paid. Appeals were delayed. Political conflicts dragged on. And so days slowly turned into weeks. Weeks into months. And in rare cases, months into years. The long stay. In earlier centuries of the Middle Ages, prison was often temporary. But by the later medieval period, especially in larger cities, longer confinement became more common. In places like Florence or London, structured prison buildings housed individuals awaiting extended legal resolution. Still, these were not prisons built for comfort or reform. They were spaces of containment. And when confinement stretches beyond expectation, something subtle begins to happen. At first, you count days carefully. You scratch marks into stone. One line for each sunrise, but after 30 marks, after 40, the lines blur together. Time becomes less sharp. The body adapts. The human body adjusts in quiet ways. Your eyes grow used to dim light. Your hearing sharpens, able to distinguish footsteps by rhythm alone. You can tell which guard approaches simply by the weight of his step. Hunger dulls slightly over time, not because the need disappears, but because the body conserves energy. Movements become slower. Breathing becomes deeper and more measured. In winter, you learn to curl tightly against the wall where drafts are weakest. In summer, you sit near the small slit of air, drawing in every faint breeze. Comfort becomes a skill, the mind under confinement. If the body adapts, the mind must work harder. In the first weeks, thoughts race. Anger rises quickly. Injustice replays again and again in memory. But over longer months, emotion shifts. Instead of anger, there may be heaviness. Instead of sharp fear, there may be quiet resignation. Medieval people did not use modern psychological language. There was no term for depression as we know it. But they understood sorrow. They understood spiritual despair. A priest might describe it as temptation. A physician influenced by humoral theory, like those who followed the teachings of Galen, might call it an imbalance of black bile, melancholy. Inside prison walls, melancholy had space to grow, and so survival required intention. Creating routine from nothing. Long-term prisoners often built routines to anchor themselves. Morning, prayer or reflection. Midday, pacing steps from wall to wall. Afternoon, conversation through cracks in stone. Evening, storytelling in whispers. Some prisoners memorized entire sections of scripture. Others composed imaginary letters to loved ones. Some counted bricks. Some studied the way light moved across the wall at different seasons. Winter light shorter, summer light longer. Through observation, they measured time. Letters and outside contact. In certain cities, prisoners could send or receive letters, especially if they had some wealth or connections. In a city like Venice, where trade and bureaucracy were advanced, written communication sometimes flowed even into confinement. But literacy was not common among peasants. Many prisoners depended entirely on occasional visits, a wife bringing bread, a brother bringing warmer clothing, a friend bringing news from the village. Those visits were lifelines. When they stopped, because of distance, poverty, or fear, isolation deepened. Illness. Inside prisons were vulnerable to sickness. Crowded spaces. Limited sanitation. Poor ventilation. If one prisoner developed fever, others might follow. During times of widespread disease, such as outbreaks connected to the Black Death, prisons became especially dangerous. Guards might limit contact. Food might be delivered more hastily. Fear seeped even into stone corridors. And if a prisoner fell gravely ill, care depended on circumstance. Sometimes a priest was called. Sometimes another prisoner offered what little comfort they could. Sometimes nothing could be done. Social hierarchy. Within walls, even in confinement, hierarchy did not disappear. Wealthier prisoners could sometimes pay for better conditions, a private chamber, additional blankets, more food. Political prisoners, especially nobles, were occasionally treated very differently from common criminals. History remembers examples of high-status captives held in relative comfort within castle towers, still confined, but not starving. But for the ordinary person, conditions were basic at best. Stone did not discriminate. Cold touched everyone. Coping through faith. Faith often became the strongest refuge. In medieval Europe, belief shaped daily life deeply. Prisoners prayed not only for release, but for endurance. They asked for forgiveness, for strength, for protection of family outside. Some believed their suffering served a purpose. Others questioned quietly in darkness. But faith gave structure. It divided the day. It offered hope beyond walls. The sound of freedom. Perhaps the hardest part of long-term confinement was sound. You could hear life continuing, market bells in the distance, horses passing, voices laughing somewhere beyond reach. Each sound was a reminder. The world moves on without you. Your absence does not stop harvest. It does not stop weddings. It does not stop sunrise. That realization could wound more deeply than hunger. Memory is survival. When walls do not move, memory becomes travel. You revisit fields you once worked, the smell of fresh bread, the feeling of rain on your face, You replay childhood moments, you imagine future ones, even if uncertain. Memory becomes both comfort and pain, but without it, identity begins to fade. And so prisoners guarded their memories carefully. They repeated names silently: mother, father, spouse, child. As long as those names remained clear, they still belonged somewhere beyond stone. When hope weakens, there are moments, especially after many months, when hope grows thin. No news arrives, no date is given, no explanation offered. You begin to wonder if you've been forgotten. Forgotten by officials, forgotten by neighbours, forgotten even by those you love. In those moments, survival depends on small acts: standing up when you wish to lie down, speaking when silence feels easier, breathing deeply in darkness. Because long imprisonment is not only about confinement, it is about endurance. The changing self. After many months, you are not the same person who first entered. Your movements slower, your thoughts quieter, your appreciation sharper. If release ever comes, you will step into sunlight changed. Freedom will feel fragile, precious, almost unreal. As night falls again in your long confinement, the corridor grows still. The drip of water echoes steadily. You lie back against the wall. You have survived another day, and in a world without clocks, without calendars, without certainty, survival itself becomes the quiet achievement. There is a difference between being forgotten in stone and being remembered in a crowd. For many medieval prisoners, confinement was not the final chapter. Prison was often the pause before something visible, because in the Middle Ages justice was meant to be seen, the purpose of public punishment. Medieval society was built on order. Lords ruled land, guilds regulated trade, churches shaped morality. And when that order was disturbed, punishment did not happen quietly. It happened where everyone could witness it, not always out of cruelty, but out of belief. If people saw consequences, they would fear breaking the rules, and so, if your sentence extended beyond prison walls, you might be led not deeper into a dungeon, but into the centre of town. The walk through the streets. Imagine the door of your cell opening again, this time not for trial, not for questioning, but for sentencing. Your wrists may be loosely bound. A guard walks beside you. You're escorted through streets you once walked freely. The same cobblestones, the same houses. But now the air feels different. People gather as you pass. Some whisper, some avoid eye contact, some stare openly. The marketplace, usually filled with trade and noise, now feels like a stage, and you're at its centre. The stocks and pillory. One of the most common public punishments was time in the stocks or pillory. The stocks restrained your ankles. The pillory secured your head and hands. Both were placed in visible locations, often near churches or marketplaces. In towns across places like Canterbury and Rouen, these wooden frames stood as permanent reminders of authority. If sentenced to hours, or even days in the stocks, you would stand exposed. People walked past. Children pointed. Merchants paused to look. Some townspeople might throw rotten vegetables. Others might simply observe silently. Humiliation was the true punishment. The body was restrained. But the mind endured the weight of public shame. Why shame mattered. In a tightly connected medieval village, reputation meant survival. Your neighbours were not strangers. They were your customers, your co-workers, your fellow worshippers. To be shamed publicly could damage trust, and trust was everything. Without trust, credit was harder to obtain, work opportunities diminished, social ties weakened. So even after the wooden frame was opened and you stepped free, the memory remained, not carved into stone, but into community memory. Fines and restitution. Many punishments involved payment rather than physical pain. If you stole grain, you might repay double. If you damaged property, compensation was required. Medieval justice often focused on restoring balance rather than long-term imprisonment. But if you could not pay, back to confinement, or extended humiliation, wealth shaped outcomes. Those with means could resolve disputes faster. Those without remained vulnerable longer. Branding and marking. In some regions and periods, more severe crimes brought visible marking, though this was not universal. A small brand, a shaved head, a mark that signalled past wrongdoing, not always permanent, but enough to remind others. Again, visibility mattered. Justice was not private, it was a lesson. Public executions. For the gravest crimes, treason, violent acts or repeated offences, execution could occur. But even here, medieval society viewed it through the lens of order and warning. Executions were often public events. Crowds gathered not merely for spectacle, but because such moments reinforced authority. In cities like London, major punishments took place in designated areas where people assembled intentionally. Yet it is important to remember, most prisoners did not face execution. Most experienced fines, temporary confinement, or public shaming. The image of constant brutality is exaggerated by later storytelling. Medieval justice was harsh by modern standards, but it was also structured by tradition and social norms, the emotional experience. Imagine standing in the stocks under a grey sky. Hours pass slowly. Your legs ache, your shoulders stiffen. People speak around you. Some mock lightly, some defend you quietly. And in those long hours, something shifts inside. Embarrassment burns first, then exhaustion, then perhaps a strange calm. Because when humiliation is complete, when there's nothing left to hide, you begin to detach. You endure. After the punishment. When the wooden frame opens and you step down, the crowd disperses quickly. Life resumes. Merchants return to selling bread. Children resume playing, and you walk home. The road feels both familiar and foreign. Your house stands where it always did. Your family waits, perhaps anxious, perhaps relieved. But the village now knows your name in a different way. Rebuilding trust may take time. In small communities, memory is long. Yet medieval villages were also practical. Work still needed doing. Fields still required tending. If you returned quietly and resumed your duties, many neighbours might eventually look forward rather than backward. Prison as a warning. For others watching your punishment, the message is clear. Rules exist. Authority stands. The system may not be perfectly fair, but it is visible, and so public punishment becomes part of the rhythm of medieval life, unpleasant, humbling, but woven into the fabric of society. When confinement continued. Not every sentence ended in public humiliation. Some prisoners returned to their cells. Political conflicts, unpaid debts, unresolved disputes. These could stretch on, and for them, the slow erosion of time resumed. Stone walls again, darkness again, waiting again. As evening settles after your day of public punishment, the village grows quieter. Perhaps you sit by your hearth, staring into firelight, replaying the crowd's faces. Perhaps you lie once more on straw in a dim chamber. Either way, the experience has changed you. In the Middle Ages, punishment was not hidden. It was woven into daily life, and survival meant learning how to carry both shame and endurance at the same time. Not every prisoner in the Middle Ages wore rough wool or carried the smell of farm fields. Some wore silk. Some had ridden into battle beneath banners. Some had dined in great halls beneath chandeliers of iron and flame, and yet even nobles could lose their freedom. But their imprisonment looked very different. Captivity instead of punishment. For common villagers, prison was often about debt, theft, or local disputes. For nobles, imprisonment was frequently political. Wars between kingdoms, rivalries between lords, disputes over land or succession. In medieval Europe, capturing a noble opponent was often more valuable than killing him. A living captive meant ransom, and ransom meant power. During conflicts like the 100 Years' War, noble prisoners were treated as assets. Their lives carried financial and political weight, so while a peasant might sit on damp straw, a captured knight might be housed in a guarded chamber of a castle, still confined, still watched, but not abandoned. A different kind of cell. Imagine a tower room high above the courtyard, a narrow but clean bed, a wooden table, a window overlooking distant hills. This is still a prison. The door remains locked, guards remain stationed outside, but conditions are shaped by status. In places like the Tower of London, high-ranking captives were sometimes allowed servants, books, and even limited movement within the fortress. Why? Because harming a noble prisoner risked retaliation. If you mistreated a lord, his allies might do the same to yours. Medieval warfare followed unwritten codes of conduct among elites. The economics of ransom was central to noble captivity. If you were a wealthy knight captured in battle, negotiations began almost immediately. Letters were sent, messengers travelled. Family estates might be taxed heavily to gather the required sum. The amount depended on rank and influence. Kings demanded enormous ransoms. Lower nobles still commanded significant sums. Captivity could last months, even years, while funds were gathered. And during that time you lived in a strange state, not free, not entirely powerless, waiting, but with hope. Psychological strain of noble captivity. Even in relative comfort, confinement weighs heavily. A noble accustomed to command now answers to guards. A lord used to issuing orders must request permission to leave a chamber. The shift in authority can wound pride deeply. Isolation from political allies increases anxiety. Will rivals take advantage of your absence? Will your lands remain secure? Will loyalty among your followers weaken? Stone walls may be softer, but uncertainty remains sharp. Famous captives. History remembers certain noble prisoners whose confinement shaped entire kingdoms. For example, King John II was captured during the 100 Years' War and held in England until ransom negotiations were arranged. His captivity influenced political balance between kingdoms. These moments remind us prison was not only about crime, it was about power, about leverage, about strategy. Privilege within confinement. Some noble prisoners were allowed books. Reading was a privilege in a largely illiterate society. Manuscripts provided mental escape, poetry, religious texts, political correspondence. Others practiced sword exercises in courtyards under supervision. Some were permitted supervised walks within castle grounds. But privilege did not erase fear, because if negotiations failed, if alliances shifted, safety could disappear quickly. Women in noble captivity. Noble women, too, could be held as political prisoners. Marriage alliances were tools of diplomacy. A captured noblewoman might be kept not in a dungeon, but in guarded quarters. Her treatment often reflected her potential value in negotiations. Again, captivity was strategic. Yet emotional isolation remained profound. Separated from children, separated from family estates, waiting for political resolution beyond her control, the uncertain length of stay. Unlike common prisoners awaiting local judgment, noble captives often faced long but defined negotiations. Months passed. Envoys travelled between courts. Money was counted. Oaths were sworn. Sometimes ransom was paid successfully. Sometimes a captive died in confinement before release. Time moved slowly even in comfort, because freedom remained dependent on decisions made far away. Honour and identity. For medieval nobles, honour defined identity. To be captured could feel like humiliation, even if no shame was intended. Knights trained for battle, lords protected territory. Capture challenged that identity. and so many noble prisoners focused on preserving dignity, maintaining posture, speaking carefully, presenting themselves as worthy of respect. Even behind walls, reputation mattered, comparison with common prisoners. While nobles negotiated ransom in castle towers, ordinary villagers often endured damp cells below. This contrast reveals something essential about medieval society. Justice and captivity were shaped by hierarchy. Your birth determined your experience. Stone walls did not erase class distinctions, they simply reshaped them. The moment of release. When ransom was finally paid, the moment of release could feel surreal. Doors opened, guards stepped aside. A once captive noble rode away, perhaps thinner, perhaps quieter, but free. Yet captivity left its mark. Trust became more cautious. Alliances were reconsidered. Political landscapes had shifted during absence. Freedom returned, but the world had moved. Reflection at dusk. As evening settles across castle towers and village streets alike, one truth becomes clear. Whether peasant or prince, confinement alters the soul. The poor endured hunger and humiliation. The noble endured uncertainty and loss of command. Both learned the same lesson. Freedom is fragile, and power can shift with surprising speed. By now, you have been inside these walls long enough that the outside world feels unreal. Days blur together. The rhythm of prison life replaces the rhythm of seasons. You no longer measure time by harvest or snowfall, but by the scrape of the food bowl, the shift of light on stone, the footsteps in the corridor. Yet in a medieval prison, one thing always remained uncertain. How long would this last? Unlike modern systems with fixed sentences, many medieval prisoners did not know when, or if, they would be released. Some were held until they paid a fine, some until a trial, some until a ransom was delivered. Others were forgotten entirely, and so the greatest weight on your mind is not the cold, not the hunger, not even the darkness. It is uncertainty. You try to calculate your fate. If you were in England in the 13th century, your imprisonment might be in a county jail under the authority of the Crown. Perhaps your case will be heard during the next assizes, those travelling courts that move from town to town. If you are lucky, that may be within months. If unlucky, it could take far longer. If you're in France, you might be confined under seigneurial justice, held by a local lord whose priorities may not include swift hearings. If you are in an Italian city-state like Florence, your imprisonment might be tied to political conflict, factional rivalries between powerful families. Release could depend less on justice and more on shifting alliances. The system is not standardized. It is personal, political, financial, and that makes it unpredictable. In many cases, prison is not meant as punishment in itself. It is leverage. If you owe a debt, prison pressures your family to pay. If you are accused of a crime, imprisonment ensures you do not flee before trial. If you are politically inconvenient, prison removes you from the board without spilling blood. So you wait. Waiting changes you. At first, you count the days. You scratch marks into stone. You whisper numbers before sleep. After a while, you stop. Time becomes shapeless. Some prisoners attempt to maintain sanity by creating routines. You pace the length of your cell. 3 steps forward, turn. 3 steps back. Again, again, again. You speak to yourself in low tones just to hear a human voice. You remember stories from home. You replay conversations. You imagine arguments you would win if you could speak again to those who accused you. Memory becomes your companion and your torment. There are others in this prison. You hear them at night. A cough from down the corridor. A moan. Sometimes laughter. Strange, sudden, unstable laughter that echoes too long in stone passages. In larger prisons, such as those attached to castles like the Tower of London, prisoners might share space in larger chambers. Not all confinement was solitary. Some rooms were crowded, filled with petty thieves, debtors, and those awaiting judgment. Crowded imprisonment creates a different kind of suffering. There is less silence, but more tension. You must guard your scraps of food, protect your small comforts, watch your neighbours carefully. Some prisoners form alliances, they share stories, they pull coins to bribe a guard for better conditions. Others turn on each other. Violence inside prison is not uncommon. Weakness invites exploitation. Strength deters it. If you are literate and literacy is rare, you may attempt to write. In certain cases, prisoners compose letters or even literary works. In Italy, the philosopher Boethius wrote The Consolation of Philosophy while imprisoned centuries earlier, and his story would echo through medieval imagination as proof that even in confinement, the mind could remain free. But for most medieval prisoners, there is no writing desk, no parchment, no ink, only stone and breath. Religion becomes central here. Priests sometimes visit prisons, especially before executions. Confession is encouraged, repentance is urged. You're told that earthly suffering purifies the soul, that pain endured patiently brings heavenly reward. This belief can comfort, or it can feel hollow. If you are innocent, you may cling to the idea that divine justice will prevail. If guilty, you may hope that confession will ease your fear. Faith is often the only structure more stable than prison walls. There are also moments of sudden change. A guard opens your door without warning. You are ordered to stand. Your heart pounds. Is this release, trial, transfer, execution? In medieval prisons, such transitions were abrupt. There were no formal notices posted weeks in advance, no careful preparation. One moment you're alone in your darkness. The next you're being led through corridors blinking in torchlight. If you're being transferred, the journey itself is harsh. Bound in rope or iron, marched through streets, exposed to public gaze. People stare, some mock, some pity. If you are being brought to trial, fear tightens your throat. Medieval trials were not always lengthy debates with lawyers and juries. In many regions, evidence might rely on witness testimony, reputation, or even ordeal. Though by the High Middle Ages, formal ordeals were declining under church influence. Still, justice is uneven. Status matters. If you are wealthy, you may hire representation. If poor, you rely on chance and mercy. And if judgment goes against you, prison may only have been the beginning. Yet not all endings are grim. Some prisoners are released quietly, a fine paid, a dispute settled, a political wind shifted, the door opens, you're told to leave. Just like that, you step outside. Sunlight feels overwhelming, air feels too wide, sounds are too sharp. Freedom is not as simple as walking away. Weeks or months in confinement have changed your body. Muscles weakened, skin pale, eyes sensitive. Your mind has changed too. Crowds feel threatening, open spaces disorienting. You may return home altered in ways your family cannot fully understand. In medieval society, reputation mattered deeply. Having been imprisoned, even without conviction, could stain your standing. Neighbours whisper, employers hesitate. You carry an invisible mark, and yet survival itself is an achievement. Many did not leave prison alive. Disease could sweep through cells easily. Malnutrition weakened resistance. Poor sanitation invited infection. Prisons were not designed with health in mind. They were designed to hold. If illness came, treatment was minimal. Perhaps a visit from a barber surgeon. Perhaps a prayer. Often nothing. In this sense, imprisonment overlapped with the broader medieval experience of vulnerability. Life was fragile outside prison walls too, but inside, fragility felt concentrated. As you sit in your cell during part 7 of this journey, you begin to understand that medieval imprisonment was not only about chains and stone, it was about uncertainty, about leverage, about waiting, about how systems of power use confinement as a tool, sometimes temporary, sometimes terminal. You learn that prison could mean a dungeon beneath a castle, a room above a gatehouse, a chamber in a city hall, or a tower cell overlooking a river. There was no single experience, but there was a shared truth. Once the door closed, control shifted away from you. Your time, your comfort, your fate rested in other hands. And in that surrender, something inside you either hardened or broke. In the medieval world, justice was never equal. Not in the marketplace, not in the church, and certainly not inside a prison cell. Who you were mattered as much as what you had done. Your birth, your wealth, your family name, your gender, your connections. All of these shaped how stone walls would close around you. Imagine two prisoners arrested on the same day. One is a poor labourer accused of theft. The other is a minor noble captured during a political dispute. Both are confined, but their experiences will be very different. If you are poor, you are likely placed in the lowest chamber, damp, dark, and crowded. You may share space with several others. Your bedding is straw, changed rarely. Food is minimal and often dependent on what relatives can bring. If you are noble, imprisonment might resemble house arrest within a castle chamber. You may have a servant. You may receive better meals. You may be allowed books, correspondence, even visitors. This was not hypocrisy in medieval eyes. It was hierarchy. Society itself was structured in layers, and prison reflected that structure. In feudal Europe, social rank was considered part of the natural order. A knight was not equal to a peasant. A lord was not equal to a merchant. Justice followed those assumptions. If you were a captured noble in England, you might even be treated as a guest prisoner. During conflicts between kingdoms, high-ranking captives were often ransomed rather than executed. They were valuable. At castles like Windsor Castle, noble prisoners could sometimes be confined under relatively humane conditions, especially if their ransom promised profit. A poor man offered no ransom. His value was limited, and so his suffering was heavier. Debt imprisonment shows this divide clearly. In many medieval towns, people were jailed not for violent crimes but for unpaid debts. If you owed money and could not repay, you could be confined until payment was made. But here is the cruel paradox. While imprisoned, you could not work. Without work, you could not earn. Without earnings, you could not pay. So prison became a trap. Wealthy debtors might negotiate. They could sell land, call in favours, arrange payment through family networks. Poor debtors often simply waited, and sometimes died. Gender also shaped imprisonment. Women were imprisoned less frequently than men, but when they were, their vulnerability increased. Separate facilities were not always available. In smaller towns, women might be confined in the same general structure, though usually in different rooms. Their treatment varied widely. Some women accused of theft or disorderly conduct faced harsh confinement. Others, particularly those of higher status, might be held in convents rather than traditional prisons. Religious houses sometimes served as places of detention, especially for women whose offences were moral rather than criminal. Accusations of adultery, scandal, or disobedience. A convent cell differed from a dungeon. There was prayer, routine, supervision by nuns rather than armed guards. Still, it was confinement. If you were accused of the witchcraft, more common in the later medieval and early modern periods, imprisonment could become terrifyingly intense. Isolation, interrogation, pressure to confess. Fear would surround you from every direction. Class also influenced punishment after imprisonment. If you were noble and found guilty, you might face execution by beheading, considered more honourable and less painful. If you were common, execution could be public and brutal. The divide extended even into death. But not all nobles were comfortable captives. Political prisoners often faced long, uncertain confinement. In the Tower of London, various high-status individuals were imprisoned over centuries. While some lived in relatively decent quarters, others experienced severe restriction, especially if they were seen as threats to the crown. Political imprisonment was a game of power. You were not held because you stole bread. You were held because you represented instability. In Italian city-states like Venice, prisons such as those connected to the Doge's palace could hold political suspects, conspirators, and rivals. Some were kept in cells beneath lead roofs that trapped heat in summer and cold in winter. Status could not always protect you from discomfort, yet it still offered advantages. Education, literacy, and influence mattered. A literate prisoner could petition, could write appeals, could frame arguments in language that officials respected. An illiterate prisoner had only spoken words, and spoken words vanish quickly. Family support was another dividing line. Medieval prisons rarely provided sufficient food. In many places, prisoners relied heavily on relatives and friends to bring meals, clothing, and small comforts. If you had family nearby, your survival chances improved. If you were a stranger, a migrant, or socially isolated, your situation grew dangerous. Some charitable religious groups attempted to assist prisoners. Acts of mercy, bringing bread, offering prayer, were considered virtuous deeds. But charity was inconsistent. It depended on local devotion and resources. And then there were children. Yes, even children could be imprisoned. There was no fully separate juvenile system. A young person accused of theft might share confinement with adults. Age could bring some leniency in sentencing, but not always in conditions. Imagine being a teenager in a stone chamber, surrounded by hardened adults, unsure of your fate. Fear would press against you from every side. The medieval legal system did not aim for equality as we define it today. It aimed for order. Order meant preserving hierarchy. So prison reinforced the structure of society. Those at the top remained somewhat insulated, even in confinement. Those at the bottom felt the full weight. And yet something else happened inside prison walls. Hierarchy blurred in unexpected ways. In darkness, stripped of titles and fine clothing, even a nobleman felt hunger. Even a merchant felt cold. Even a knight felt fear. Stone equalized the body even if law did not. The experience of waiting, of uncertainty, of hearing iron doors close. These sensations did not care about lineage. Your heart beats the same whether you're a peasant or a prince. Your breath shortens the same way in damp air. In prolonged confinement, identity can begin to loosen. You stop being lord, baker, merchant, servant. You become prisoner, and that word is heavy. Some prisoners adapted by forming quiet communities inside shared cells. They told stories, shared memories, created fragile bonds. Others withdrew inward. Some prayed more intensely than ever before. Others questioned everything. Social status shaped your comfort, but it could not fully protect your mind. As days turned to weeks, and weeks to months, a deeper transformation took place. You began to see yourself through the eyes of authority. You wondered, am I guilty? Am I cursed? Has God judged me? Medieval culture closely linked misfortune with moral meaning. Illness, poverty, imprisonment, all could be interpreted as signs of divine displeasure. So prison was not only a legal state, it could feel like a spiritual verdict, and that internal weight sometimes hurt more than chains. Yet survival stories existed too. There were prisoners who endured long captivity and emerged resilient. There were nobles who negotiated release. There were debtors whose families scraped together coins. There were women confined temporarily and later reintegrated into society. Prison was not always a life sentence, but it was always a test of endurance, of hope, of identity. In medieval society, prison was only one piece of punishment. It was not always the final step. Very often, imprisonment was temporary, a waiting room before something far more public, far more visible, and far more humiliating. Because medieval justice was not just about holding someone. It was about showing something. It was about sending a message. If you were a prisoner in the Middle Ages, you knew that the stone walls might not be the worst part of your fate. The worst part might be what came next, When the door opened, chains were fastened tighter, and you were led outside. Outside meant witnesses. Outside meant judgment in front of everyone. Medieval communities were small. Towns were tight clusters of houses, workshops, and market squares. Villages were even smaller. Everyone knew everyone. Reputation mattered deeply. Honour mattered deeply. So punishment was designed to be seen. Imagine you have been held for theft. Days pass. Then one morning the guard arrives. You're told to stand. Chains are secured around your wrists. You're led through narrow streets toward the centre of town. People gather. Children whisper. Merchants pause their work. And you are placed in the stocks. The stocks were simple. Wooden frames with holes to lock your ankles or wrists. Sometimes both. Once secured, you could not move freely. You stood, bent, or sat there for hours, sometimes for days. The physical discomfort was real. Muscles cramped, limbs swelled. But the true punishment was not pain. It was humiliation. Passers-by could mock you, throw scraps, insult you. In some cases, rotten vegetables were hurled. Your crime was announced publicly. You were made into an example. The message was clear. This is what happens if you break the rules. In England, public punishments often took place in visible spaces, sometimes near churches, sometimes in busy markets. In cities like York, public justice was part of civic life. It was not hidden. The pillory was even more exposed. Unlike stocks, which often restrained the feet, the pillory locked the head and hands. You stood upright, face fully visible, unable to turn away from the crowd. Hours could feel endless. Sun burned your skin in summer. Cold cut through you in winter, and every eye became a weight. Public shaming worked because medieval society valued reputation intensely. To lose honour was devastating. For tradespeople, reputation meant livelihood. If customers believed you dishonest, your work could vanish. For women accused of moral crimes, public humiliation could stain their name permanently. Punishment did not always require blood. Sometimes shame was enough, but there were harsher outcomes too. Whipping was a common corporal punishment. You might be tied to a post, stripped to the waist, struck repeatedly with a whip or rod. The number of lashes could vary. The pain was sharp, immediate and unforgettable. But again, the crowd was part of the process. People watched. Punishment reinforced communal boundaries. It reminded everyone that order existed and that authority had teeth. In some cases, branding marked the body permanently. A heated iron pressed to the skin. A letter burned into flesh. It could identify a thief, a deserter, a repeat offender. The mark turned the body into a living record of crime. There was no hiding it. You carried your past visibly. Execution, of course, was the most final punishment. But even execution varied by crime and status. Hanging was common for many offences. The gallows were often placed outside city walls, visible from roads, a warning to travellers. If you were sentenced to hang, you might spend your final night in a cell listening to distant sounds of preparation. The next morning you would be taken out under a guard. Sometimes a priest accompanied you, offering final prayers. The journey to the gallows was slow. Crowds gathered. Some came out of curiosity, others out of moral duty, some out of grim fascination. Execution was both punishment and spectacle. It reinforced power. In London, executions near the Tyburn became public events that drew large gatherings. People treated them as grim occasions of justice and warning. Beheading, often reserved for nobility, was quicker but still public. Even in death, hierarchy showed itself. More severe punishments existed for certain crimes, especially treason. Treason was not just breaking a law, it was breaking loyalty to the ruler. Punishments could be extreme and deliberately terrifying. The goal was deterrence through fear. Yet not all punishments ended in death or permanent injury. Fines were common, especially for wealthier individuals. If you could pay, you might avoid corporal punishment entirely. Again, wealth shaped outcomes. Justice, though firm, was not uniform. Interestingly, some medieval communities preferred reconciliation over harsh punishment. In smaller villages, disputes might be settled through compensation agreements. Restitution to victims could replace physical punishment. Community harmony sometimes mattered more than spectacle. But when crimes threatened order, violence, rebellion, repeated theft, authorities responded strongly. From your perspective as a prisoner, uncertainty would dominate. You might not know whether your confinement would end with a fine, public humiliation, or something irreversible. Waiting would stretch your nerves thin. Every footstep outside your cell could signal decision. The mental strain of not knowing might be as heavy as any chain. And yet, punishment was not purely about cruelty. Medieval justice systems believed they were maintaining balance. Law was tied to divine order. Authority was seen as God-sanctioned. To punish wrongdoing was to restore harmony. This worldview shaped how people understood suffering. If you were punished, many believed it was deserved, even necessary. That belief made resistance complicated. To rebel against punishment could feel like rebelling against moral structure itself. Still, fear was powerful. Children growing up in medieval towns would have seen public punishments. They learned early what consequences looked like. The sight of a neighbour in stocks was unforgettable, and perhaps that was the point. Prison prepared the body. Public punishment marked the identity. Together they formed a system designed not only to restrain, but to teach, to warn, to shape behaviour through memory. If you survived your sentence, if you returned home, life might continue. But the memory would not fade easily. You would remember the crowd, the silence before judgment, the sound of wood locking around your limbs, the weight of eyes. In medieval society, punishment was not hidden behind walls, it lived in the open, and as a prisoner, you knew that your story might end not in darkness, but in daylight, surrounded by everyone you'd ever known. When the noise of public punishment faded, when the crowd dispersed, when the heavy doors of the prison closed once more, what remained was silence. And in that silence, something far more difficult began. Because surviving medieval imprisonment was not only about enduring hunger or cold, it was about surviving your own mind. Inside a cell, time behaved strangely. Without clocks, without structured schedules, without clear light and darkness in underground chambers, hours blur together. Morning and evening lose their sharp edges. Days stretch. Nights stretch even longer. If you were a medieval prisoner, your greatest enemy might not be chains. It might be emptiness. The emptiness of waiting. The emptiness of not knowing when judgment would come. The emptiness of wondering whether anyone outside still remembered you. Routine became a lifeline. Even in harsh confinement, prisoners tried to create patterns. You might wake when faint light crept through a slit in the wall. You might whisper prayers at certain moments each day. You might count stones in the wall, trace cracks with your fingers, repeat memories like stories told to yourself. In a world where control had been taken from you, small rituals restored a sense of order. Faith was perhaps the strongest anchor. Medieval Europe was deeply religious. Most prisoners would have interpreted their suffering through spiritual meaning. You might believe your imprisonment was a test sent by God, or punishment for hidden sins, or part of a larger divine plan you could not yet see. Prayer gave structure to the day, morning prayer, evening prayer. Confession whispered into darkness. If a priest visited, confession could bring relief. Even if your body remained confined, your soul felt momentarily freer. Some prisoners memorized psalms, some sang quietly to themselves. The rhythm of sacred words could steady a racing mind. In monasteries that occasionally served as holding sites for certain offenders, religious routine was strict and repetitive. Bells marked the hours, prayer divided the day. But in ordinary prisons, structure depended on the prisoner's own effort. Imagination also became a survival tool. You might replay memories of home, the smell of bread baking, the sound of livestock in the morning, the laughter of children in a courtyard. You might imagine walking freely again through familiar streets. These mental journeys were fragile but powerful. They reminded you that prison was not your entire identity. Memory preserved your sense of self. Some prisoners carved marks into walls, simple lines to count days, one scratch per sunrise. A visual proof that time, though slow, was still moving. In certain historic prisons, archaeologists have found such markings centuries later. They are quiet testimonies to endurance. Conversation, if you were not alone, helped too. Shared confinement created strange bonds. You might speak softly to the person beside you, exchange stories, share rumours about possible release, talk about past mistakes, or about dreams for the future. These conversations kept humanity alive. Isolation, on the other hand, was far harsher. Solitary confinement existed in some contexts, especially for those considered dangerous or disruptive. Without voices, the mind could turn against itself. Sounds grew louder in the dark. Dripping water echoed endlessly. Footsteps above felt ominous. You might begin to imagine things. Fear could magnify every small noise. Without distraction, guilt could grow heavier. You might replay your crime repeatedly in your mind. Ask yourself whether you deserved this. Wonder how others judged you. In medieval culture, shame and honour were deeply internalized. A prisoner did not only fear punishment, he feared being remembered as dishonourable. For women, this internal struggle could be even sharper. Reputation shaped marriage prospects, family stability, and community acceptance. Imprisonment risked more than physical hardship. It threatened social identity. Some prisoners tried to hold on to dignity through posture and behaviour. Even in chains, they stood straight when guards passed. They spoke respectfully. They tried to maintain self-control, because dignity, once surrendered, was difficult to reclaim. Letters, when allowed, were treasures. A written message from family could sustain hope for weeks. But literacy was limited. Many prisoners could not read or write. In those cases, news came by spoken word during visits, and visits were not guaranteed. Distance, poverty, or stigma might prevent loved ones from coming. The absence of visitors could feel like abandonment. Hope became the dividing line between endurance and despair. If you believed release was possible, through trial, ransom, payment, or pardon, you endured differently. You counted days with expectation. If you believed your imprisonment would stretch indefinitely, the weight pressed harder. Some prisoners turned inward spiritually, others hardened emotionally. A few might grow bitter, but even bitterness required energy. And prison slowly drained energy away. Physical weakness from poor diet affected the mind. Malnutrition reduced strength. Cold nights reduced sleep. Lack of sunlight affected mood. Medieval people did not have modern language for depression or trauma, but they understood sorrow deeply. Melancholy was a recognized state. Spiritual despair was feared. To lose hope entirely was considered dangerous not only to the body, but to the soul. Guards, too, played a role in mental survival. Some were harsh and indifferent. Others, particularly in smaller communities, might show small mercies. An extra piece of bread, a few minutes of conversation. These gestures mattered more than they might seem. Because in confinement, kindness shines brighter. Stories exist of prisoners who composed poetry in captivity, who reflected deeply on life and faith, who emerged changed, sometimes wiser, sometimes quieter. Prison stripped away distraction. It forced confrontation with self, and that confrontation was not easy. As a medieval prisoner, you would learn patience whether you wanted to or not. You would learn how long a night can truly feel. You would learn how powerful a single ray of sunlight can be when it reaches your cell. You would learn that survival is not only physical, it is mental, it is spiritual. It is the daily decision to endure one more hour, one more night, one more uncertain tomorrow. The day of release did not always arrive with celebration. Sometimes it came quietly, a guard unlocking a door, a name spoken into the dim air, chains removed not with anger, but with routine indifference. If you were a medieval prisoner fortunate enough to be released, the moment might feel unreal. Because prison changes your sense of time. You grow used to walls, used to limits, used to the sound of keys instead of open wind. And then suddenly you are told to stand, to step forward, to walk out. Release in the Middle Ages happened in several ways. You might have completed your sentence. You might have paid a fine. Your family might have gathered enough money for ransom or compensation, or a local lord might have shown mercy. Royal pardons were also possible, especially during certain celebrations or political moments. In England, kings occasionally granted pardons tied to major events or public gestures of favour. Under rulers like Henry II, legal systems became more organised, and royal authority over justice expanded. That authority included the power to forgive, but forgiveness did not erase memory. When you stepped outside the prison gate, sunlight could feel overwhelming. Your eyes, used to shadow, would narrow. The open sky might seem too large. The sounds of markets, animals, and conversation might feel almost chaotic after long confinement. Freedom was not instant comfort. Your body might be thinner, weaker, your clothes worn, your reputation uncertain. The world had continued while you were confined. Seasons changed, children grew, neighbours adapted, and now you had to re-enter that world. In small medieval communities, everyone knew who had been imprisoned. News travelled quickly. If your crime was minor, unpaid debt, small theft, reintegration might be possible. If your crime was serious, suspicion could linger. Trust, once broken, was fragile. Guild membership might be affected. Apprenticeships could be lost. Marriage prospects might shrink. If you were branded or publicly punished, the mark followed you. Some former prisoners moved away to begin again. Travelling to a different town meant fewer questions. In growing cities like London, anonymity was slightly easier than in a small village. Urban life allowed more blending into crowds, but travel itself required resources, money, strength, connections. Not everyone had those. For some, release meant returning to the same lord or authority who had ordered their imprisonment. Feudal society was layered with obligation. If you were a serf or bound labourer, your freedom from prison did not mean freedom from duty. You returned to fields, to workshops, to the same rhythms as before, and yet something inside you had shifted. Prison leaves marks that are not always visible. You might find yourself quieter, more cautious, more aware of consequences. Some former prisoners became deeply religious afterward. They interpreted their survival as divine mercy. They attended church more faithfully. They donated what little they could in gratitude. Others hardened. They trusted less, spoke less, kept emotional distance from neighbours who had judged them. Family reunions could be emotional. A spouse who had struggled alone, children who had grown used to your absence, parents who feared you would not return. There was relief, but also adjustment. You had changed, and so had they. Economic reality often struck quickly. Lost time meant lost income. Debts might remain unpaid. Tools might have been sold. Livestock might be gone. Rebuilding stability required effort and patience. For women released from imprisonment, reintegration could be especially complex. If accusations involved morality or social norms, reputation damage could be long-lasting. Community acceptance was not guaranteed. Yet medieval society also understood survival. People made mistakes. Communities sometimes forgave, especially when labour and cooperation were needed. Forgiveness was practical as much as moral. Interestingly, some prisons functioned primarily as holding spaces before trial, rather than long-term punishment. So for certain individuals, release simply meant judgment had passed, whether through fine, corporal punishment, or declaration of innocence. Trials by jury began developing more formally in England during the 12th and 13th centuries. Royal courts gained influence over local justice. The legal transformations connected to reforms under figures like Henry II shaped how cases were heard and decided. But even with evolving systems, justice remained uneven. Wealth mattered, connections mattered, status mattered. If you were poor and powerless, reintegration was harder. If you had allies, your path was smoother. And then there were those who did not leave through the main gate. Escape, though rare and dangerous, did occur. Prisons were not always secure by modern standards. Rotting wood, loose stones, corrupt guards. Desperation created opportunity. But escape carried enormous risk. If caught, punishment intensified, and life on the run in medieval society was precarious. No identification documents existed, but communities were tight-knit. Strangers were noticed. Without protection of a lord or guild, survival was uncertain, so most prisoners, if released legitimately, chose the difficult path of rebuilding rather than fleeing. Freedom in the Middle Ages was not abstract. It was physical. The ability to walk without chains, to sleep without a locked door, to breathe air that did not smell of damp stone, to choose where to stand, and yet, freedom also meant responsibility. You were visible again, accountable again, vulnerable again. Prison, for all its harshness, removed certain choices. Outside, choices returned, along with risk. If you were wise, you might live more cautiously. If you were angry, you might live more recklessly. But either way, your experience inside those walls would never fully leave you. You would remember the silence, the waiting, the echo of footsteps in corridors, the way hope rose and fell like breath. Release was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a different challenge. How to live with memory. How to carry the past without being trapped by it. Not all medieval prisons were the same. The word prison might bring to mind a dark underground dungeon, and sometimes that image was accurate. But imprisonment in the Middle Ages depended heavily on where you were held. Your experience could vary dramatically based on location, status, and the authority controlling your confinement. If you were imprisoned in a castle, your cell might be deep within thick stone walls. Castles were military structures first. Their primary purpose was defence, so holding prisoners was often secondary. Cells inside castles were sometimes former storage rooms, towers, or lower chambers not originally designed for long-term habitation. You might be confined in a narrow room with a single slit window. The walls would be damp, air circulation minimal, light scarce. In some major royal fortresses, imprisonment became more structured over time. The Tower of London is one of the most famous examples. Though widely remembered for high-profile prisoners, it held a range of detainees across centuries, from nobles accused of treason to religious dissenters. Conditions there varied widely. High-status prisoners sometimes had access to better quarters, furniture, and even servants. Low-status prisoners faced far harsher treatment. Status mattered deeply. A noble accused of political wrongdoing might be confined in relative comfort, under guard, but not in filth. A commoner accused of theft might be placed in a cramped, dark holding chamber, with little regard for comfort. If you were held in a city jail rather than a castle, your experience could differ again. City jails were often attached to guild halls, courthouses, or administrative buildings. They were designed primarily for short-term detention, holding people before trial or until fines were paid. Space was limited. Overcrowding was common. Cells might hold multiple prisoners together. Privacy did not exist. You would sleep close to strangers, share air thick with breath and dampness. Sometimes city jails were located above ground, with barred windows facing streets. This meant noise from outside filtered in. Market vendors shouting, horses passing, church bells ringing. You could hear life continuing just beyond reach. That closeness to normal life could either comfort you or torment you. In some regions, monasteries or church authorities also held individuals under ecclesiastical custody. Church courts dealt with moral offences, disputes involving clergy, or matters like marriage and vows. If you were held under church authority, conditions might focus more on reflection than punishment. The goal was often repentance. You might be confined to a small chamber but required to pray regularly. Fasting could be imposed. Spiritual discipline replaced physical brutality. However, this did not mean comfort. Religious confinement could still be isolating and strict. Debtors' prisons formed another category. If you owed money and could not repay it, you might be imprisoned until payment was made. This created a cruel cycle. Without freedom, earning money was nearly impossible, so prisoners relied on family or community members to gather funds for release. In many cases, debtors were responsible for paying for their own food while imprisoned. If you had no support, conditions could deteriorate quickly. Hunger became more severe. Health declined. Again, wealth determined experience. Some debtors with resources could arrange more tolerable confinement, even renting better rooms within certain facilities. Others languished in hardship. There were also temporary holding cages in marketplaces or town centres, used for very short confinement before immediate punishment. These were highly visible, public, designed to reinforce authority in plain sight. Geography influenced conditions as well. A prison in a damp northern climate differed from one in a drier southern region. Moisture affected walls, cold affected bones. Ventilation varied depending on architectural design. Rural areas might not even have dedicated prison structures. Instead, a storage barn, cellar, or manor outbuilding could serve as a makeshift holding space. Security was often basic. A locked wooden door, iron chains fixed to walls. Community members sometimes participated in guarding. In these smaller settings, imprisonment felt less anonymous. You were not just a prisoner, you were someone's neighbour, someone's former co-worker, and that closeness shaped treatment. Food, too, varied by location. Large city prisons might have slightly more organised distribution systems. Remote facilities depended heavily on a regular supply. If harvests were poor, prisoners felt it. If political unrest disrupted trade routes, prisoners felt it. Medical care was minimal everywhere, but in larger cities, occasional access to physicians or barber surgeons might occur, especially if the prisoner had status or influence. But for most, illness inside prison was endured rather than treated. Sanitation differed widely. Some prisons had rudimentary latrine systems. Others relied on buckets emptied periodically. In cramped underground spaces, waste accumulated quickly. The smell became constant. Ventilation could not keep up. All of these factors, architecture, authority, wealth, geography, shaped your experience far more than the simple label of prisoner. Two people imprisoned in the same century might live completely different realities. One in a guarded tower chamber with relative comfort. Another in a rotting wooden cell barely fit for animals. Even duration mattered. Short confinement for a minor offence might be survivable without lasting physical harm. Long-term imprisonment, especially in poor conditions, could permanently damage health. Bones weakened, skin developed infections, teeth decayed further without care, vision worsened in darkness. Yet medieval people were resilient. They adapted quickly to circumstance. The human body, though vulnerable, adjusts to scarcity. The human mind, though fragile, learns to cope. What unified all these variations was uncertainty. No prisoner fully controlled where they would be placed. No prisoner could guarantee comfort. Fate depended on power structures far above their reach. To be imprisoned in the Middle Ages was to step into a system deeply shaped by hierarchy. Your birth, your wealth, your connections, your alleged crime, all determine the texture of your confinement, stone or wood, light or darkness, crowded or solitary, temporary or prolonged. When we look back at medieval imprisonment, it is easy to imagine only darkness, cold stone, chains, echoing footsteps in narrow corridors. But by now, after walking through every stage, arrest, confinement, punishment, survival, release, and the different kinds of prisons, something more complex appears. Medieval prison was not a single experience. It was a mirror of medieval society itself, hierarchical, religious, community-centred, unequal. To be a medieval prisoner was not simply to be locked away. It was to be placed at the edge of society, temporarily or permanently, while that society decided what to do with you. And that decision was rarely just about crime. It was about order, honour, authority, and fear. Unlike modern systems where long-term incarceration is common, medieval prisons were often holding spaces. They were waiting rooms before judgment. The real punishment frequently happened in public, through humiliation, fines, physical pain, or execution. Prison itself was part of the process, not always the final sentence, and that distinction changes how we understand it. Imprisonment was uncertainty, waiting without knowing the outcome, listening for footsteps that might signal trial, mercy, or something worse. It was the mental strain of not knowing whether tomorrow meant freedom or finality. Yet inside those stone walls, humanity did not disappear. People prayed, people hoped, people counted days with scratches on walls. They formed fragile friendships. They replayed memories of home to stay sane. They whispered confessions in the dark. They imagined sunlight. Even in confinement, identity persisted. A prisoner was still a parent, still a spouse, still a craftsman, still a believer. The walls restricted the body, but the mind travelled far beyond them. What makes medieval imprisonment especially striking is how visible justice was. Punishment happened before crowds. Stock stood in marketplaces. Gallows stood outside city gates. Justice was not hidden. It was performed. In cities like London, public executions and punishments reinforced royal and civic authority. The spectacle reminded everyone that order had consequences, and yet, for all its harshness, medieval justice was not purely chaotic. Over time, systems became more organised. Royal courts expanded authority. Written records became more common. Under rulers such as Henry II, legal reforms strengthened centralised control and formalised procedures that shaped how imprisonment functioned. This did not make prison comfortable, but it made it more structured, less arbitrary than in earlier centuries. Still, inequality remained central. A noble might experience guarded house arrest. A poor labourer might experience damp darkness and hunger. Wealth could purchase comfort. Connections could secure mercy. Poverty often meant suffering, and that reality reflected the broader medieval world. Life itself was unequal. Justice followed the same pattern. Perhaps the most powerful truth about medieval imprisonment is this: it was temporary for many. Unlike modern prisons designed for years or decades of confinement, medieval imprisonment often ended quickly, through payment, punishment, or execution. The system aimed to resolve cases, not warehouse individuals indefinitely. But temporary does not mean easy. Even a few weeks in harsh confinement could weaken the body. Even a few days in humiliation could permanently damage reputation. Even a single public punishment could reshape a life. And yet, people survived. They rebuilt. They returned to fields and workshops. They re-entered families. Some carried shame. Some carried gratitude for mercy. Some carried scars, visible or invisible. Prison in the Middle Ages was not designed to rehabilitate in the modern sense. It was designed to enforce order, to remind communities of boundaries, to demonstrate authority. And in that sense, it worked within its own cultural framework. When we imagine spending a night in a medieval cell, we might focus on fear, the cold floor, the dim light, the sound of chains shifting in darkness. But beyond the fear lies something more human. A person sitting against stone, breathing slowly, thinking about home, hoping for morning, and that image connects centuries, because confinement in any era strips life down to essentials: breath, memory, hope. If you had lived in the Middle Ages and found yourself imprisoned, your survival would not depend only on strength. It would depend on patience, faith, mental endurance, and the fragile belief that doors eventually can open. Medieval prisons were harsh, imperfect, often unjust, but they were also deeply human spaces, filled with fear, regret, resilience, and longing. And through understanding them, we understand something about the medieval world itself, a society where justice was visible, hierarchy was powerful, and survival required inner strength as much as physical endurance. And now, as we step back from those cold stone walls, we leave behind the echoes of chains and footsteps and return to the present, carrying a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to be a medieval prisoner.